reason I say that is it seems like about every couple years technology is advancing so quickly with our naval ships that who knows what it may exactly look like as it comes out. But being that this is a historical society presentation, I'm going to take you back as to why we were able to get this naming. And it didn't happen because of anything that we have done in the modern era, this commission. It goes back, and it's funny, I have Chuck's notes from when Chuck and I presented to the Secretary of the Navy back in September of 2011. And we actually had his outline that he presented that we have as part of this. And I think I will give all this to the Historical Society so they have it when we do get the ship in port, because it is kind of cool. But when Chuck Black, myself, and Alan West, who was then our congressman, went and met with Ray Mabus, who was the Secretary of the Navy, it was kind of a far-fetched idea. And we were trying to convince him that we should be the next city to get this designation. Now, there have been others that had, brought this up in the past, worked hard. I can tell you the people from Broward Navy Days, Fleet Week, obviously a lot of different groups I'll run through. But if you look at the history, our presentation started out with one, for those that don't know, Ray Mabus is the former governor of Mississippi. And as the former governor of Mississippi, Mississippi is known for a significant number of things, and one of those is that they happen to manufacture ships in Mississippi. And I remember it so well when we presented that Pascagoula, Mississippi would be the producer of this ship, and it happened to be the producer of the most Navy ships on record as far as we knew that day. And that was part of our presentation to start. But let me take you back a little bit in time in terms of the timeline that was presented. And the way we did it was talking about our history with the Navy. And I look out here and I see Marianne Gray and so many people that have worked. And I think back to before you, the people that were so involved with Mr. Millsaps and everybody that really helped us out so much. And it wasn't what we did, and I can't emphasize that enough. It's what this community has done going back years and years. And it starts with that we started going back 180 years. And in the 1830s, Navy Lieutenant Levin Powell commanded the Swamp Sailors during the Second Seminole War here in Fort Lauderdale. That contingency came down to reinforce Major William Lauderdale's troops who were stationed along the north bank of the New River when they first constructed Fort Lauderdale. So we made sure that the Secretary of the Navy understood that the group that came in to reinforce Major William Lauderdale's group was in fact the Swamp Sailors during the Second Seminole War. Then you go forward a few years, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave his final Jackson Day speech on board the USS Potomac, which was a presidential yacht known as the Floating White House, while it was anchored here in Fort Lauderdale. So that was an interesting connection we were able to also come up with as we did the historical research for this. 1942, the city of Fort Lauderdale became an important naval training center during World War II. In 1942, radar, gunnery, and parachuting schools began operating at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, which today, many of you know, is Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. 1943, West Prospect Airfield, known today as Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport, served as a training facility for naval aviators. And I think some of you may recall, but former President George H.W. Bush served here as a pilot in 1943. And what you're hearing from me is essentially what we did with the Secretary of the Navy, starting to explain the connection between Fort Lauderdale and the Navy. 1959, Fort Lauderdale Council of Navy League of the United States is established with Admiral Claude V. Ricketts as the organization's first speaker. Who's here from the Fort Lauderdale Council Navy League? See Marianne, I see we have a few other Navy League people, but that was 1959 and we had Admiral Ricketts speak. 1988, the Navy League established Fort Lauderdale's first Fleet Appreciation Week. How many of you all were involved in that? 1988, the first year. Nobody. That surprises me.
They just showed up.
Boy, I would have guessed that somebody from that original 1988 run. In 1990, Broward Navy Days was formed, and Fort Lauderdale's annual Fleet Week celebration is expanded to provide a one-of-a-kind experience to visiting U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. Then in 2006, the Navy League dedicated the patriotic Lone Sailor statue at Esplanade Park along Fort Lauderdale's New River. That is only one of 11 in the United States that honors the contributions of sea servicemen and women and their families, past, present, and future. And then the interesting thing was, in between all that, we commissioned 6 different ships here in Fort Lauderdale. First one was the USS Leyte Gulf in 1987, the USS Cole in 1996, the USS Higgins in 1999, the USS Bainbridge in 2004, and we've had both the Cole and the Bainbridge back recently as part of Fleet Week, and then the USS Jason Dunham from the Coast Guard in 2010, and then the USS Jason Dunham, I'm sorry, from the Navy, and then 2012, the USS Coast Guard cutter Richard Etheridge. And as you run through this, you realize we weren't given this designation because of what anybody did.
Spontaneity. That's the weather for you.
Yeah. You touched it.
It's ready to get sailing.
Yeah.
It was trying to head out to sea.
Hopefully we don't have that experience with the... Is that right there?
Yeah.
And as I was saying, we weren't given this designation because of what was done in the last 5 years. It's the history in Fort Lauderdale. It's the individuals that did all these namings, that did all these commissioning ceremonies. It's the officials and the locals that hosted all these Fleet Weeks. You know, one of the most fascinating things about Fleet Week is that we are consistently voted the #1 port of call for the sailors on the East Coast. So it's so you realize it's not, as I said, it's not necessarily what we do in a presentation, but it's what you do when they come into port. We open our arms, we open our hearts, we open our doors to the Navy, and we embrace them. And Secretary Mabus, as I indicated, it was a guy that came, he's actually now one of the longest, I think the longest serving naval secretary on record, came in after serving as governor of Mississippi. And one of the things we talked about in his office was he said, you know, Fort Lauderdale has such an unbelievable reputation with the Navy. He says, every time I talk to the sailors, every time I talk to the officers, every time I talk to the admirals, they all say, that city just embraces us. That city just treats us better than any other city. And it is such a wonderful badge to wear. And to be, I'm so honored and privileged to represent a city that has that reputation that the Navy comes to town and they feel at home here. They feel like this is their town. This is where they're safe, secure, comfortable. They can be who they want to be and really enjoy the town. And I think we kind of have a nice way of looking out for them. Let me just touch briefly then on the timeline, because I mentioned Chuck Black earlier, and I want to recognize John Aurelius here, former commissioner. John, thanks for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see you out here.
I was at each one of those christenings of those ships.
And John was at every one of those commissionings, by the way. Right?
I was.
So, but, you know, it started with a few individuals that kept talking about it. And in 2010, Chuck Black was named as the committee chair of the commissioning of the USS Jason Dunham. And if you all remember the Jason Dunham commissioning, it was an amazing, emotional commissioning. I mean, the story of Jason, his family coming to town, again, the family coming to town, not necessarily involved in the Navy, and feeling the same way that this town just opened up its hearts to the family of Jason Dunham. And Chuck was served as a committee chair, and I know many of you also served on that committee. And that was sort of the discussion starter, if you will, about, you know, we can take this to the next level. And I remember talking to members of the military, members of the Navy, members of Congress about, well, how did this ship get named? And we started looking into how can we get the USS Fort Lauderdale. And Chuck, obviously, just being the persistent, strong-willed individual, he just stayed with it. He really did. And if a guy deserves credit for this, it's Chuck Black. He's the guy.
Yay.
So as I said, in 2011, Chuck, myself, we went to Washington. We had Alan West, who was then serving as our local congressman. We had support communications from former Congressman Clay Shaw. We had support communications from former Congressman Ron Klein, as you remember. It was a bipartisan effort. In fact, if we could get Congress to do in a bipartisan fashion what they did with this, it would be wonderful, because right now they can't seem to agree on anything, but we had such a bipartisan effort. When you had Congressman Shaw, Congressman Klein, Congressman West, Now Congressman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Deutsch, Congresswoman Frankel, excuse me, all working together in such a bipartisan manner to push this. It was really kind of cool. So we went there in 2011. We sent, as I said, Chuck's presentation was just fantastic with his notes. It's a couple other things he had in his notes that I'll hit on. That he brought pictures of the Fort Lauderdale Council from 1959, the Claude Ricketts photo as he presented to the Fort Lauderdale Council. We had an Arleigh Burke photo. We had the fact that during the 1980s, approximately 300 ships visited our port and had those details. The Fleet Appreciation Week that eventually grew into Broward Navy Days, now headed up by Mary Ann. We had the Secretary of the Navy come here on March 1, 2002 at the request of the Fort Lauderdale Council and presented here because of our Fort Lauderdale Council's commitment to support the sea services. They came to town to thank us. We reminded the Secretary of the Navy of that. We went through the commissionings. We also went through the fact that even though we didn't commission like the Gridley, we supported it strongly out of Fort Lauderdale. Went through the Admiral Holloway coming here August 22nd, 2011, coming to thank us. And then Dooley's Basin and Dry Dock that was supporting World War II efforts back then. I'll give you a quick stat on Dooley's Basin and Dry Dock. They built 7 144-foot non-magnetic minesweepers here in Fort Lauderdale, 4 172-foot minesweepers, 21 110-foot subchasers here in Fort Lauderdale, 18 104-foot subchasers, 28 85-foot subchasers, and numerous 65-foot air rescue boats right here in Fort Lauderdale. Again, part of our presentation. You'll love this part, Pat. In 1912, Gate City Sash and Door Company here in Fort Lauderdale sold their windows to the armed forces for use throughout the world for their bases, which included many of our naval bases. And we were able to prove that in our presentation to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, I haven't bought a window from Gate City since I've been mayor, so I'm not sure what happened to that company. But I'm sure they had a heck of a run. Then we had in HAK, who remembers Hendricks, Abel, and Krauss here in town, weapons company. They manufactured 1.6 million 37 millimeter shells, projectiles, and 50 millimeter shells that were used by the Navy. Rex Bassett Inc. was the first company that produced two-way radios, and that was used by the produced here in by the Navy, used by the Navy. Florida Aircraft Radio Corporation produced radio parts for the aircraft and the Navy. And then we listed a bunch of subcontractors that produced war material. And Port Everglades stored fuel for Defense of the Caribbean and aviation fuel for the planes at the Naval Air Station. So as we ran through that, I think we won the Secretary of the Navy over with the commitment of Fort Lauderdale through the years. But to move forward, in 2012, we had the commissioning of the Etheridge. And for those of you who remember that, that was just spectacular. Etheridge is an amazing story. If you haven't read the book Fire on the Beach, buy it, read it. It's the story of the first African American who served in the Coast Guard on the North Carolina shore and did an amazing rescue after being a slave during the Civil War. Came out, worked on the North Carolina shore, and did a substantial rescue, many rescues, but one that was very well recognized called Fire on the Beach. That commissioning was 2012. Also, Chuck Black serving as committee chair of that commissioning. And at that event, we again pushed forward the idea of a USS Fort Lauderdale. Moved forward to 2013, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz joined us in the naming request. Then she, along with Congresswoman Lois Frankel, Congressman Alcee Hastings, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, Ted Deutsch, and Frederica Wilson all joined us in a letter to the Navy supporting the request. They continued 2013, 2014. We were lobbying every time we'd go up to Washington for anything. We would make sure we got over to lobby on that. 2015, Chuck Black again, Mr. Persistent, I should say, and God bless you, Chuck. He again got with Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and actually our naming got pushed back slightly, and many of you remember Gabby Giffords. Gabby was the Congresswoman who was shot, as you recall. Well, they named a vessel after her, and hers was actually moved up, and it was obviously something that she was one of Debbie's closest friends, and that was something that we obviously fully agreed with. and we were told that we were somewhere in the pipeline. 2015, we again went up there, and again, I want to thank Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Lois Frankel, Alcee Hastings, Mario Diaz-Balart, Ted Deutsch, and Frederica Wilson joining us again in communications with the Secretary of the Navy. And then 2016, many of you were sitting in a City Commission conference meeting when I got a call from my aide. She said, "You have the Secretary of the Navy on the phone." And I looked around, I saw my 4 commissioners, I saw everybody. I said, I think I need to take this call. So I slid out of the room, and Secretary Mabus, just absolutely one of the most wonderful men you'll ever meet. Can't wait to bring him down to Fort Lauderdale again and thank him. But as I sat down in my office to take the call at about 4:35 in the afternoon, he said, "The Navy has decided to look favorably upon the request of the city of Fort Lauderdale." And he says, "I'm looking at the hat that you left me and some of the clothing items you left me here in my office." And he says, we're going to name a Navy vessel after the USS Fort Lauderdale. But he said, "This is embargoed information." Now, I hadn't dealt with a lot of embargoed information in my years in public office in Fort Lauderdale. I said, "What exactly does that mean?" He says, "Well, you can't say anything until this weekend." He says, "Because we have it under a recommendation. They have up until, I believe it was Friday, Chaz will give me the exact, Friday at 6, that somebody could object to it. And then as of 6 o'clock on Friday, we could release it." So we were kind of checking everything the next couple days, making sure nobody objected. And we got word that was, in fact, confirmed. And as we know, we announced in the following Monday. So it is an amphibious transport dock ship. It's the USS Fort Lauderdale. It'll begin construction this year, December of 2016. Not surprisingly, it's going to be built by Huntington Ingalls Industries in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I told them we were very pleased that they chose a Mississippi boatyard to build the USS Fort Lauderdale. And I think as he returns home after his tenure as Secretary of the Navy, they'll be very pleased in Pascagoula by that too. So we should have delivery in about 4 to 5 years. It is a ship that takes a lot of time to build. The commissioning will take place in Port Everglades. We've been told that, and so hope many of you will be there for that one. I'll give just a couple of last details, and then we'll head inside. But the other U.S. Navy San Antonio class ships, a couple that have been named recently, you've got the last one. The next one will be the 28th one. That's Fort Lauderdale. 27 was Portland. 26 was named after Congressman Murtha, John P. Murtha. 25 was Somerset. 24 was Arlington. 23 was Anchorage, and 22 was San Diego. 21 was New York. So it's kind of a neat history we have there. And just the last point, if I could pull this note up. It is it's going to be, like I said, Huntington Ingalls Industries. It will have 4 turbocharged marine diesel engines with 2 shafts. How many of you all own boats? So let me put it in perspective for you. It's 41,600 horsepower that'll be powering that boat.
Good Lord.
Now you get out and fish and you see some of these people that have the twin 300s and now triple 300s. Let's call it 41,600 horsepower. The length's going to be 684 feet. The beam will be about 105 feet. It's going to displace approximately 25,000 long tons, 25,300 metric tons, full load. The draft will be 23 feet, so it'll pull into Port Everglades. We've confirmed that, regardless of whether we get the dredging completed. The speed, and this is what I find really interesting, the speed is in excess of 22 knots.
Wow.
They don't tell you it's top speed, and it's actually still one of the secrets the Navy keeps, is that they will tell you it's in excess of a certain number. But it is now, they've told us this speed, this vessel that is 684 feet long will go in excess of 22 knots. So it'll cover some pretty good distance pretty quickly. It'll have 374 sailors. It'll have Marines. It'll have a landing force of about 700 in terms of Marines. It'll have a surge capacity up to 800. For the guns, it has 2 Bushmaster 2 30mm guns, fore and aft, 2 rolling airframe missile launchers fore and aft, and 10 50 caliber machine guns throughout the vessel. It'll have 2 Super Stallion helicopters, 2 Osprey tilt rotor aircraft,
Whoa.
and up to 4 Sea Knight helicopters, or the AH or UH-1 helicopters. And also it's going to carry landing craft of 2 LCACs and 14 expeditionary fighting vehicles. So if you look at this, it's going to be quite the ship and quite the representative of the city of Fort Lauderdale. And in closing, I just want to once again emphasize, when they talked about this and it came out, everybody was saying, well, the elected officials, and certainly our members of Congress, were fantastic. Certainly the city commission, city staff, everybody worked their tail off to get this done. But the credit belongs to the community. Because when they were looking around at the community, oh, thank you. Is this a Marco Rubio moment? When they were looking around at the community and looking at who do we name it after? Why do we name it after a community? Time and time again, it came back not to the electeds, but to our neighbors. All of you, the Fleet Week, the Broward Navy Days, the Naval Council, even the ESGR that you all do. When we were talking about this, was the fact that we host all these events for the Navy and we make them feel like this is their town. And repeatedly, it was about the people. And so when this ship gets brought into port, it's going to be spectacular. But I hope you all feel the pride that you were involved in getting it, because it was the community that embraced the Navy, and in return, the Navy embraced the community. And so, on behalf of the city, we could not be more pleased. I ran through the timeline a little quicker because of the heat, but I will tell you, we'll leave this here for the museum to have on record. But if you do see the Chuck Black family, please thank them. Chuck was so darn persistent, so thorough. Even during the presentation, at times I leaned over like, Chuck, I didn't know that. But he really was spectacular in his presentation. And Ray Mabus, I haven't called the secretary to let him know about Chuck's passing, but I was going to let him know that because he formed a bond with him, as many in the Navy do here. And I guess in honor of Chuck, we'll make him honorary chair of this commissioning when it takes place. I had asked him. With that, let me turn it over to the staff here at the Fort Lauderdale History Museum, but we'll have a little timeline that everybody can follow up on and enjoy. And God bless you all. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you all for being here, and I hope it was as informative and enjoying for you as it was for me. That was very interesting. Thank you so much, Jack. And on behalf of the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society and Board of Trustees, just wanted to recognize Jack for being here today and representing Chuck very well, and for talking to us about the USS Fort Lauderdale that we're all very proud of. Thanks. Thank you, Jack. And so feel free to come back inside and enjoy another glass of beer, glass of wine, and I think there's a few chips left. We'll be mingling for a little while longer. Thank you so much.